In today's Top 10s video, we're looking at the 10 worst race riots in American history. And in at number 10, it's the Battle of Hayes Pond, North Carolina, in 1958. In 1956, racial recognition was given to the Lumbee Indian tribe, enraging KKK leader James Cole, who organized terrorism against them for 2 years, then planned a night rally of 50 to 100 men to burn a cross and incite violence. The Lumbee arrived with 500 men and guns, shot out the light and routed them. Cole abandoned his own wife and waded through a swamp to flee, but was later arrested and served 2 years. Number 9. The Ferguson, Missouri Riots, 2014. On the 9th of August, Michael Brown, black, was shot to death by Officer Darren Wilson, white, after a confrontation due to obstructing traffic. Witnesses claimed Brown was shot several times in the back, touching off riots lasting months. A grand jury chose, on the 24th of November, not to indict Wilson, renewing the riots. 12 buildings and 2 police cars were torched, and at least 205 people arrested. 1 man was filmed committing suicide by cop. Number 8. The Wilmington, North Carolina Insurrection, 1898. In this year, the Democratic Party won the state legislature on a campaign of white supremacy. 25 whites in Wilmington then demanded Alexander Manley, a black newspaper owner, shut down and leave. Manley refused, and up to 2,000 white veterans burned his business to the ground. The crowd then degenerated into anarchy, roaming the city, beating and killing blacks. From 6 to 100 blacks died, and the leader of the mob, Congressman Alfred Waddell, was set up as mayor. Number 7. The Philadelphia Nativist Riots. The Nativists, white Protestants, openly expressed their disgust with the Catholic Irish, and during a rally on May the 3rd, the Irish charged the stage. The Nativists returned in force 3 days later and rioted for 3 days, burning down 2 Catholic churches. Police could not restore order. The riot died out after 14 people were killed. 2 months later, the Irish armed themselves for the 4th of July, and the Nativists stormed their church with cannons. A gun battle erupted for several hours, resulting in 15 people dead. Number 6. The Detroit Race Riot, 1943. A fistfight on Belle Isle between a white sailor and a black man he thought insulted his girlfriend turned into a community-wide brawl that had been brewing for years. This spilled into the city and raged for 3 days, with whites beating random blacks and blacks retaliating. 34 were killed, 25 black, 17 of those killed by the white police. This riot did not stop until FDR sent in the military, and there was $2 million in damage. Number 5. The Watts Riots, 1965. Los Angeles was a powder keg for many years, and on the 21st of August, Marquette Fry, black, was pulled over for drunk driving. He, his brother, and their mother finally began fighting the 2 white officers who arrested them. The police had to dispel crowds throwing bottles and rocks. 6 days later, central LA was a burning war zone. 30,000 blacks rioted, looted, set fires, and beat whites at random. 34 were killed, 268 buildings razed, and $40 million done in damages. Number 4. Nationwide rioting after Martin Luther King Jr.'s death in 1968. King was assassinated on the 4th of April in Memphis, and rioting began that evening in cities around the nation, 110 in all by the end. Washington, D.C. was the worst hit, with looting, brawls, and widespread arson for 5 days. 12 people were killed, over 6,000 arrested, 1,200 buildings razed, and 13,600 military troops forced to guard the city, the largest military occupation of any American city since the Civil War. Number 3. The Red Summer, 1919. Whites around the nation rose up against the blacks in response to the blacks taking many jobs in industrial cities. More than 36 suffered large-scale riots. From the 1st of January to the 14th of September, at least 43 blacks were lynched, 11 of them burned at the stake. The police in DC watched idly for 4 days as whites pulled blacks off streetcars, beat and mugged them. Rioting lasted 5 days in Chicago, where 38 people died, 23 of them black. Number 2. The Los Angeles Rodney King Riots, 1992. After years of deep enmity between black civilians and the white LAPD, Rodney King's assailants were all acquitted. Citywide rioting began immediately, lasting a week before the National Guard, Army, and Marine Corps were called in. South Central saw 2 infamous beatings of white motorists by black gangs, massive looting by blacks focused in Koreatown, where store owners armed and defended themselves in gunfights. The police did little to stop this. 53 were killed, over 11,000 arrested, and over $1 billion done in damages. Number 1. The New York City Draft Riots in 1863. Following the union institution of the draft, the Irish immigrants in NYC degenerated into pure lawlessness, quickly changing their targets from the rich class to blacks. The police superintendent was beaten nearly to death, and 120 people were killed, 11 of them black men lynched from streetlights and trees, one set on fire. 15 buildings were razed before troops from Gettysburg arrived and skirmished with the crowd. The equivalent of $19 to $96 million of damages was done in just 3 days. So I really hope you enjoyed that video, and I'd love to know what you think of it, so please leave a comment below. I'm also going to link over to another video that you might enjoy, so just click on that thumbnail on the screen now, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we put out a new video 7 days a week, and you can also visit us online. Just go to TopTenz.net. Thanks for watching.